Hey, Bio30s, and welcome to our discussion today about reproductive strategies. Before I get started, just wanted to clarify something about the last video, our part two discussion on meiosis. I forgot to indicate the card that appeared on the video at the very end of the video when we were just finishing up. There was a review video that I wanted you to watch. If you haven't had a chance to watch that video yet, just click on the card up here. That will get you to the link on the review for meiosis, which will discuss the 2 rounds of division and independent assortment and crossing over everything we discussed in our last 2 videos. Okay, so today's topic is going to be about different reproductive strategies that organisms use. We've already talked a lot about the formation of gametes, which is at the heart of sexual reproduction. And I will obviously refer to a little bit about sexual reproduction today, but we're going to save most of that conversation for our 5th unit, which will be about reproduction and prenatal development. But for now, just be aware that sexual reproduction is used by a lot of organisms. It's basically genders that have to be involved. You've got a male and a female that are producing a sperm and an egg, and those haploid gametes will come together through fertilization to produce a diploid zygote, which will then mitotically divide into an embryo and then into a fetus to then eventually become a brand new organism. But that's not what we're going to spend a lot of time on today. We're going to be discussing a lot about asexual reproductive strategies, and there are some really cool ones out there. Some very unusual ones in the organizational kingdoms, or the kingdoms of life on the planet. Some very interesting ways that some organisms go about reproducing. Now, before I get started on that video, if you want to take a look right here, there's a quick little video up here that will kind of give you a quick overview of the methods that I'll be discussing today. So if you want to watch that right now, go right ahead. And but without any further ado, I'll get started with some of these reproductive strategies in organisms. Now, the first one, and they're all listed up here on the board. Just so you know, there's 6 that we'll be covering today before I discuss what is called alternation of generations, which will be our last bit of the discussion today. The first method I want to discuss is binary fission, and it's essentially a mitosis in bacteria. Bacteria basically divide using this process. They basically can make clones of themselves. Remember that bacteria are prokaryotic. They don't have a nucleus, so their genetic material is basically swimming commando in the cytoplasm. But they use a process called binary fission to basically make copies of themselves, and they just do it that way. Pretty straightforward. So if you know mitosis, and you do because we've covered it, this is basically just mitosis, but dealing with bacteria. However, there are bacteria that bacteria can evolve and can change, and they can swap genetic information. Well, if they're only using asexual reproduction, that's very difficult to create variation in different strains of bacteria. And bacteria can use a way that's an asexual method to basically create genetic variation within strains of bacteria. And that process is called conjugation. On the board here, I've drawn a very rudimentary diagram, but over here, there's a great view of it on the slide below me here. Basically, bacteria will use a bridge, and the bridge is called a pilus. And the pilus is basically allows one adult bacteria to basically link to another adult bacteria, and they can actually swap genetic information. And by doing this, they can change their genome slightly. This might allow, let's say, a bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics to then spread its genetic makeup to other bacteria to make them, maybe more resistant to bacteria, or any one of many other traits that the bacteria could transfer with this swap of genetic material. So there are ways for bacteria to basically change their genetic makeup, even though they are reproducing asexually. Now, next, we have a method called budding. Budding is basically, I guess for lack of a better term, if it's a single-celled organism like yeast that are doing it, Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a species of yeast, that's brewer's yeast that does this, it would be considered to be uneven mitotic division. So instead of having 2 even cells forming like we do in binary fission, you're essentially getting a little bud. It would be like one adult cell kind of pops off a smaller version of itself off to the side, and then that little bud just kind of separates off to the side and then grows into an adult yeast cell. But this can get even more complicated with organisms like hydras do this as well, and there's a diagram of the hydra right over here. They're a very fascinating creature, and if you're interested in learning a little bit about hydras, you can click on the link right here to watch a short video about hydras and all the cool stuff that they do. But when we discuss hydras, or we discuss budding, I should say. Sorry, hydras are among the best known species that actually that do this. And as you can see in the diagram, you can see that little mini hydra that's sort of budding off of the adult. I mean, the analogy would be if I was standing here right now and a little small Mr. Baudestein popped off the side of me and then scurried away. That would be a form of budding, as creepy as that might actually sound. But that's budding. The next one is vegetative reproduction. Vegetative reproduction is a method that's used by plants. Plants, as you're well aware, do a lot of sexual reproduction, but they can also create clones of themselves. Some plants can do this. Aspens do this. Potatoes can do this. Raspberries, strawberries. And what they do is they produce like suckers, or they produce shoots. They create root systems under the ground that basically then pop off clones of themselves. So if you have an aspen tree growing in your yard, you may have noticed that it will sucker little plant, like you'll see little trees that will grow through your grass. I've got aspens in my backyard, and every summer it's a battle to basically chop off these little aspen suckers that are these little aspen sprouts that are coming off the aspen trees in my backyard. But all of these little mini trees that are arising off the root system, they're all clones of the original parent. So genetically, they're identical to the original parent that spawned the root system. Now, this can be a very successful method of reproduction. The oldest living organism on the planet right now is a colony of aspen trees that lives in Utah, and they are estimated to be roughly 80,000 years old. They have been basically connected by a single root system for almost 100,000 years. And even if forest fires come through the area that burn the trees down, the root systems are so deep and so widespread that they can actually then basically grow back up off the root system. So these trees have been in existence for a very long time. And if you want to know a little bit about these trees, you can click on the link right here to watch a video about probably the most famous colony of trees in the world, known as Pando. But yeah, they're using vegetative reproduction to basically create a colony that is genetically identical to all the other trees in the colony. Another form that I alluded to in earlier videos for this unit was that some organisms can basically lose a limb and then regrow the limb. I talked to you about lizards that can do this. They can lose a tail and then grow their tails back. But some species will actually take it even further. For example, if I chop the limb off of a starfish, that limb will actually grow a new body if it doesn't get eaten or get destroyed. Both halves of that split organism can basically regrow into completely new organisms. So the example you can see here is a limb of a starfish. You can see the small starfish that's actually growing off of the leg. So a starfish can regrow a limb, but a starfish's limb can actually regrow an entire body off of it. And that process is called fragmentation. And there's another famous organism that does this, and it's a form of a flatworm that actually, if you split this flatworm in half, it basically can regrow into two organisms. There's a study that's been done, or this has been done, many times in the past, but it's sort of a famous experiment. If you take this flatworm and you cut it through the head and leave the rest of its body intact, the flatworm will actually grow two heads. It'll actually, both halves of its head will actually reform into two new heads on the organism. So there are some organisms that can actually regrow themselves. And again, this is all due to the fact that the cells involved are these totipotent cells that I talked to you about in the first discussion in this unit when we discussed genetic material. But very fascinating way for organisms to kind of reproduce themselves. And one more that's kind of really interesting is called parnarthogenesis. And this basically is a way that you can have an entire species that doesn't require males. And there are a couple of examples of this. Honeybees are an example of this. Essentially, queen bees and worker bees are all female. Drones are male, but basically drones are only required occasionally to produce new queens. female queens can produce worker bees without any genetic input from a male bee. You only require a drone to produce a new queen. So all the bees that are in a hive are basically produced by a queen without the use of any males, and that is a method of reproduction known as parthenarthogenesis. There's also a lizard in New Mexico called the whip-tailed lizard. It's actually a hybrid of two different lizard species, and that entire species, or I guess hybrid species, they're all female. There are no males in the population, and they basically can produce eggs that are unfertilized, and those eggs can then go on to become zygotes and then become fully formed embryos and fetuses, and then eventually are born. So another really cool method of reproduction. And there is one more method of reproduction that is going to lead into our final discussion here. And I didn't write it on the board, but this is another method of reproduction. You can also produce spores. There's a lot of plants out there that can produce spores. Ferns can produce spores, and spores are essentially analogous. They're like seeds are used. A seed is produced when you have two gametes. You have pollen and a plant's egg come together and form a seed. It's a diploid seed. Spores, on the other hand, are basically haploid seeds. They are genetic clones of the parents that spawn them, and then they can go off and actually produce genetic copies of the parent when they're released. Now, spores do play a major role in my final topic today, and this is sort of the big topic that is going to be the trick of this section of the unit. It's something called alternation of generations, and there are some plant species out there that actually swap their genetic makeup. They exist in two forms. As humans, we only exist once we're created as a zygote. Our entire lives, we live out as diploid organisms. All of our cells have pairs of chromosomes, and that's the way we exist all of our lives. The only part of us that doesn't have diploid configuration are our gametes. However, in certain species of plants, ferns do this, for example, they exist in a diploid as well as a haploid state. And in the diagram here, I've indicated this in the diagram. On the top of the diagram is the part of the life cycle where the organism, or this fern, or this, in this case it's not a fern, it's just a generic diagram for any organism that undergoes this process. The top part of the diagram is the haploid state of the organism. The bottom half of the diagram is where the organism lives out its life as a diploid organism. Now, there are two classifications in these types of organisms. The diploid part of the life cycle, that organism that grows, that version of the plant in this case, is called, is called a sporophyte. A sporophyte is a 2N version of the plant that will go on to produce spores. And as I mentioned earlier, spores are haploid. So we're going to get back to that in about 2 seconds. These spores are asexually going to reproduce and divide into the haploid version of the organism, which is then called the gametophyte. Now, the gametophytes will then produce gametes. So you can see where the names come from. Sporophytes produce spores. Gametophytes produce the gametes. And you know what a gamete does. You know the gametes are going to be it won't be a sperm. I got sperm here, but we can call it sperm because it's probably going to be easier. But it could be a version of pollen or sperm. I mean, it just depends on what the organism is. But they're going to produce these gametes, which we then know are going to come together to form a zygote. And then that zygote will then go on to become the sporophyte. So there's actually two parts to this life cycle, and this is why we call it alternation of generations. The question becomes now, what are all the processes? So you can see on my diagram, I've got several question marks indicating what process is going on in order for this to happen. So this is a kind of a question you could see on an exam. So how do we actually figure this out? Whenever I look at these diagrams, the first thing I look for are the gametes, because I know the gametes, when they come together, are going to create a zygote. And I know, and again, we talked about this last day, there were three things that I talked about, little configurations. I got 2n to 2n, n to n, 2n to n, and n to 2n. These were the four configurations that I mentioned in one of the last videos I showed you guys. If I have a 2n to 2n scenario, that is going to be the division called mitosis, right? If it's n to n, it's going to be mitosis. If it's going to be 2n to n, it's going to be meiosis. And if it's going to be n to 2n, it's going to be fertilization. So what you need to know in these diagrams are where things are haploid and where they are diploid. Well, gametophytes are haploid. Sporophytes are diploid. That would be a good thing to remember. If you can remember that sporophytes are diploid, gametophytes are haploid, that would be very beneficial in this diagram. But here's what I do. This is when I look at these diagrams, here's how I dissect them. The first thing I look for are my gametes, and I'm going to look for my zygote. Because I know that when I have two gametes forming into a zygote, I know my zygotes are always going to be 2n by definition. My gametes are always going to be n by definition. So we're dealing with an n to 2n scenario there. So I know that this part is going to be fertilization. I know that has to be fertilization. Otherwise, what else can it be? I'm going from n to 2n. It's got to be two gametes coming together to form a zygote. Okay? So I know that's fertilization. That's easy enough. Now, I'm going to my zygote, and if I can remember that a zygote, I should remember a zygote is always 2n because we come from zygotes and we're diploid as well. If I know a zygote is 2n and it's going to form eventually a sporophyte that's 2n, I'm going from what configuration to what configuration? Well, I'm going from 2n to 2n. So 2n to 2n means that this process has to be what? That process has got to be mitosis, right? And that kind of makes sense. We know that a zygote is going to mitotically divide into an embryo, into a fetus, and eventually into a full-grown organism. So that isn't much of a stretch either. The rest of the diagram is where things get a little trickier for people. Now, if I know my sporophyte is 2n, by default, you know the other major structure in this organism has to be haploid, which is my gametophyte. And here's where people run into trouble. Because I've got a gametophyte that is n, right? This is an n organism. It is a haploid organism, and it's producing haploid gametes. Now, when people think about the production of a gamete, and based on everything we've discussed in previous lessons, when we think about the formation of gametes, we automatically think meiosis. But that's predicated on the fact that the organism producing the gamete is a diploid organism. These organisms right now are not diploid. They are haploid. We're going from a haploid to a haploid configuration. I'm going n to n. So that can't be meiosis. That's got to be what? It's got to be mitosis. That's going to be mitosis at that part. So that's going to be a mitotic division to produce the gametes, which is a little bit outside the realm. But when people try to throw questions at you on this and try to fool you, this is where they'll try to fool you. Because they know that you're thinking a gamete is produced through meiosis. Most times it is. But if it's an organism that's a haploid organism producing a haploid gamete, there's no meiosis there, right? Because the organism, we have the same amount of DNA going in as we do going out. That can't be meiosis. Well, I've got another scenario here. I know that my 2n sporophyte is going to produce eventually haploid spores. Well, that's 2n to n. What's that going to be? 2n to n, we know, is going to be meiosis. So I know that the production of spores, that is going to be produced through meiosis. So there's my meiosis or my mitotic event in this life cycle. And then finally, I'm going from spores to my gametophyte, and that's going to be n to n. That means that I'm going to have mitosis going on there. So let me recap this whole life cycle. Let's start with the gametophytes. The gametophytes are haploid. They are going to produce haploid gametes. They're going to produce them through the process of mitosis, because I'm going n to n. Those gametes then are going to fuse together through the process of fertilization. We know that going from n to 2n is fertilization, so I'm going to produce then a diploid zygote. And this is always a great anchor. Always anchor on the zygote, because the zygote, no matter what, is always going to be diploid. You know that a zygote's diploid, and you know your gametes are always going to be haploid. So that's a good kind of a starting point. That sort of shows you where the n phase ends and where the 2n phase begins. It's right there. That fertilization event is sort of the demarcation line between the end of the end phase and the beginning of the 2N phase. The zygote is going to become a sporophyte. The sporophyte is 2N as well. That's going to be powered by mitosis, mitotic division of the zygote into the sporophyte. The sporophyte we know is going to produce spores, and spores we know are haploid. We're going from 2N to N now. That's got to be meiosis now. That's going to be meiotic division, and that's going to be the start of the N phase. So you can see that when we produce the zygote, we're starting our 2N phase. When we produce the spores, we're entering the N phase of the life cycle. And then the spores are going to mitotically divide into our gametophytes, and that basically brings the life cycle, I guess, full circle. And that's basically the generation, the alternation of generations. Here's that generic diagram in your notes right here, a little bit more neatly drawn than maybe what I did, but you can take a look at that as well. And here's an actual diagram of an actual organism. And again, this is a fern, but you can take a look at sort of how this is playing out. I would be familiar with these because you are going to probably see these on upcoming exams, or diploma as well. And then finally, to end the topic today, it isn't just plants that undergo alternation of generation. There are some animals that do it too, primarily jellyfish. Jellyfish also undergo an alternation of generations. They actually move between using sexual and asexual reproduction. So, for example, the jellyfish, when we think of a jellyfish, we think of the free-swimming jellyfish, the medusa, which would be right over here in the diagram. There's my medusa. That's what we think of when we think of a jellyfish. And those medusa are basically producing the gametes. They're producing egg and sperm, and they will form a larva. And the larva will then basically plant itself on the bottom of the ocean somewhere, and it will mature into what's called a polyp. And the polyp is actually going to be non-mobile, and then it will then asexually reproduce to form the actual medusa again, which then becomes the sexual reproducing part of the life cycle of the jellyfish. So kind of a cool thing that, even animals can do versions of the alternation of generation, or just alternating between sexual and asexual reproduction. That's our discussion for today. That's actually the end of the unit. You've got one more booklet to complete. If you can finish up the cell division reproductive strategies question booklet, that is pretty much all she wrote for the unit, and you can be expecting your unit exam coming up fairly quickly. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll talk to you real soon.